So I want to welcome Pablo Legoretta to the Library of the History of Human Imagination for one of our TED-Med conversations. Pablo, welcome today.
Thank you, Jay. I'm honored to be here and very happy to be surrounded by such amazing works that show the human imagination.
Well, wonderfully, you brought a gift, Pablo. So I just want to say thank you right on the record here. You know, Pablo came with his own human genome map, okay? You know, a beautiful poster, which I didn't have in the library, so thank you. That will take a nice place in here. And you might wonder why I didn't have one. It's because I felt I had one inside.
I'm glad you like it. Jay, it's a really interesting piece because I think it shows the culmination of a lot of work of a lot of really important people in life sciences. And it really expresses a very important achievement of humans, of trying to really understand what makes us tick.
So let's talk about the financial models behind innovation for a minute. So in the 15th century, when the North and South America was discovered by a group of explorers who were sailing across the ocean on their way to China, or so they thought, and they bump into this North and South America landmass and go, whoa, look at this, okay? There's something big time going on here. Suddenly, the idea of financing all those expeditions to bring back silver and gold and natural resources created the modern corporation, created the need for individuals financing, state financing. So how does the life sciences get financed? If we're engaged in an entirely new world of discovery, and we've seen sort of before, new discoveries, new worlds require new financing mechanisms, how are we going to finance this time?
So there are multiple approaches to financing. And for years, medical research in the developed world has been driven by governments. Right. The US government made a very concerted effort to actually fund medical research through NIH. It started really after World War II, right. Has ramped up dramatically to the point where we started our business. NIH had a yearly budget of about $24 billion 16 years ago. That has grown to about $30 billion per year, which is really money that's given to scientists. And NIH talks about 50,000 plus grants per year to 50,000 plus scientists. So that has been an engine of discovery, of innovation. Like the US government, there's also governments in other countries. Right. In the UK Medical Research Council, Karolinska in Sweden, Weizmann in Israel, Max Planck in Germany. So a lot of the funding of innovation has been driven by governments, but then you have also the very important participation of other private sector entities like venture capital and companies.
So let's come back to governments for a second. So the US government spends about $30 billion a year on biomedical research. And what does the rest of the world together spend? Do they spend about as much again or twice as much if we add the whole rest of the world roughly?
My guess is that it's probably a similar amount.
About 50-50.
Yes.
So about $60 billion US a year is invested in basic biomedical research, not just basic, of all kinds. And then you've got all these private sectors, corporations, et cetera. And how much do they put in?
It's 100 billion plus.
Another 100 billion?
Yes.
So they're bigger than the governments?
They are bigger than the governments. You're looking at the research budgets of big pharma and right. biotech companies, and it's probably more closer to like 150 billion or so.
So we've got about 60 billion plus 150 billion. We're talking big numbers here, right? So yes. There's $200 billion a year, Pablo, financing expeditions into the New World. Okay, yes. But the New World in this case, instead of it being North and South America, the New World is the world of the cell. Right?
In our bodies.
The world of the body. We're on a journey into the body.
Yes.
Okay? And we're all going together. Big governments are financing it. Private enterprises financing it. Is anybody making any money here, Pablo?
It's a hit and miss industry, and yes, companies make money. Biotechs, it's sort of a history of rags and riches. Scientists are many of them by definition dreamers, and right. they have great ideas. And what's great is that this people that dream of really interesting approaches to address very important human problems end up eventually finding people to finance them and believe in them, and to put the money on the table that may get some of these things financed through clinical trials and eventually approved and right. converted into a drug.
Every time we talk about cost, we talk about within an environment, right? So cost to develop a drug for the US market, cost to develop a drug for the European market can be a different issue. But at some point, we're going to change the way we develop drugs. We're not going to be running these giant clinical trials. We're going to have drugs that work on much smaller subsets of the population. Clearly, the way we've been doing this, the industrial model of one-size-fits-all molecules, is that going to be around too much longer?
Probably not. I agree with you that it is changing. Unfortunately, it's not changing at the fast pace that we would like it to change to bring down the cost of development. But this goes into what we've talked about already, which is personalized medicine. If we're able to narrow the patient population for which a drug might be very efficacious and safety would be tolerable, then we can demonstrate efficacy by looking at this smaller patient population with a therapy. And if that ends up happening, then the cost will be smaller because we're actually doing smaller trials that are likely to be also much more efficacious if we have the right person, to try the drug, to do the trial on.
Can we get the regulatory regimes to change fast enough? I mean, typically regulatory regimes change pretty slow. There's a lot of resistance, a lot of political risk in changing regulatory regimes here in the US, and I'm sure true in other places as well. It sounds to me like the scientists want to do small trials, but are the regulators going to be ready here, or is this something that's going to take quite a while before the regulators finally get pushed into this?
So they're not there today. Regulators are not there today. They're, catching up. And I think over the next 5 years or so, I think it will change in a very meaningful way. And we will see, much smarter trials in smaller patient populations, and that should result in
Who will lead that, Pablo? Will that be led by the US, or is that likely to be led by Europe or by Asia? Who's going to be the leader in demonstrating that a new regulatory regime is far more effective than the old?
So I think it will be led by the US and Europe. And there's a lot of talk about other regions of the world making important strides, like Singapore and other countries. I frankly think that it's going to be a long time before those other countries can make important strides, because one thing that people forget is that there's an incredible environment that exists in the US and in Europe, and more so in the US, which is really an ecosystem that has been built over the last 50, 60 years of academic institutions that are very involved in medical research, with scientists that have been working together for years, venture capitalists that come in and fund academic research, capital markets that are sophisticated enough in this country to actually provide the money, the risk capital to finance these inventions. So this ecosystem that exists here is very difficult to replicate. It actually would take years for other countries to have what we have here today.
Most people might think, when they don't know the specifics, that biomedical research is done by drug companies, or they're done by private. But the U.S. government is such a giant funder of biomedical research that they literally tilt the playing field in favor of research institutions like universities, the great universities, all doing the kind of research. But do people realize that these universities are doing this research, or do you think that that's known by the biomedical community but not by the citizens of America?
It's not, I believe it's not well understood, and the point you make is really important, because what has happened in medical research over the last, again, 30, 40, 50 years is that it's changed dramatically. The model of innovation and in this industry has changed. We went from a model where you had what was called a fully integrated pharmaceutical company, where everything was done in-house, from basic research to clinical research, clinical trials, and then marketing and commercialization of our product, to a very fragmented model where we now have academic institutions which are involved in basic research and a little bit of applied research. Then you have the biotech industry, which does early stage clinical trials and early stage applied research. And then big pharma, which has really become more of a marketing machine for the whole industry. But what this has resulted in is a very interesting, very dynamic model, where you have academic institutions which are funded by governments principally, and also some private foundations, where a lot of innovation for years has been generated. This has actually resulted in inventions that are patented.
Right.
That technology is later, once it's mature, it's actually licensed to biotech companies, which then do the early stage clinical trials. That actually creates royalties, and that's where we come in. And then when these inventions are then, biotechs typically take these inventions through phase 2, so they fund phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials. But once a product has good phase 2 data, what they try to do is to look for a big pharma partner. And what the big pharma partner is going to give them is the money for phase 3, which is very expensive, but also the potential to market the product worldwide because they have the marketing.
Well, the biotechs are sort of the midwife here.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. And so, and the pharma companies become sort of the parents. Okay. You know, that raise the children.
Yes.
Okay. And the government is basically sort of creating the opportunity to have a pregnancy, if you will. Okay. But what you're saying here is that government funds major research institutions who then turn around and create useful property that derives revenue back to the institution. Does it provide revenue back to the government, or is the government basically saying, look, whatever revenue you get, we're happy, you're a research university, keep it and use it for more research?
In this country, NIH does collect royalties from some of their inventions, and it's very important.
Right.
But with respect to the private research institutions, both universities and research hospitals, and all of the grants that they get from NIH, that money actually, and the revenues that are derived from the inventions, which is basically royalty payments over 15, 20 years, are kept by the universities. They own it, they share that with the inventors, and typically about 20 to 40% of the value of the royalties are allocated to the inventors, and that's what makes this a very dynamic market, because inventors are highly motivated given that they share in this. But universities keep this, and they actually use it to fund more research, and they also monetize it with us, selling this IP and this patents and this royalties to us. And by doing that, instead of having to wait to collect those payments over 15, 20 years, they can get a big upfront payment from us and then use that money to fund research on a more accelerated basis.
I want to go on a leap of imagination here. I want to securitize health instead of drugs. So could there be a day where a government says, or somebody says, look, I've got a population that I own of 10,000 people, but there's 1,000 of them that are really healthy. Okay? Pay me $1 million and I'll sell you them, okay, because you can make money because some other capitated system will give you a royalty on those healthy families staying healthy. Could you see securitizing health someday? Could that happen? Think how big a market we have, Pablo.
It's interesting. It's an interesting thought, and I think that there would need to be an important change in the mentality, change in laws, in the way the whole insurance industry works.
Could happen.
But it could happen, and in fact, you're starting to hear that in some cases, companies, for example,
pay me to be healthy.
Exactly right.
Well, it sounds absolutely fascinating, and most people, when they hear about companies that are essentially capital market engines, their reaction is, well, that's some kind of banking story, some kind of financial company. It's not. It's actually a life sciences story. It's a story about innovation. It's a story about unlocking creativity. It's a story about funding things that we desperately need to fund in way smarter ways than we do it. It's a story about getting the ore out of the ground and into products and services that work and not leaving it locked in the ground. And I think way too often, especially in health and medicine, there's very little attention paid to the business side of health and medicine. And I think, as you've demonstrated, there's a 21-story building at Memorial Sloan Kettering that is a direct result of smarter financial structures and engineering that is not only a positive, but it's a positive that would have never happened any other way. So at TED-Med, those are exactly the kind of stories we're looking for, and the Library of Human Imagination is exactly the place to tell them. So I want to welcome and thank you, Pablo, for joining us today. It was a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure for me to be here and spend this time talking to you.